You know, I often post tweets asking about critical thinking. I ask people a few questions. When you're presented with new information, do you stop and think about it, or do you just react to it? Do you ask the important questions like, what is this? Why is it happening? How is it happening? Where is it happening? And probably the most important question to ask is if it's even real. The last question on validity. It's an important one to think about because without validation, you assume, and we're all guilty of assumptions. Take every video or tweet we see online, for example. We all instantly react to it. Without thinking, we gloss over the headline and keep scrolling. We just assume it's not important. Assumptions can take two directions. We can assume something to be true, or we can assume it to be untrue. The same can be said for any perceived threat, whether take it seriously or we don't. Take the so-called deep state as an example. We all know it or have heard about it. Whether you believe in it or not, there's one thing we can all agree on. We know it's a threat, whether it's real or not. But what about what I refer to as the other deep state, Communist China? We see the headlines and we hear the news, but do we really understand why they're so dangerous? While you're thinking about that, I want to tell you a story of two brothers. Let's call them Russ and Charles. And they're the two meanest kids on the block. Now, Russ is a little older than Charles, and while Russ was growing up, he picked on all the neighboring kids. A few fought back, but he beat up most of them. That is until one day, Russ met another neighborhood kid named Sam. Sam was just as tough as Russ and maybe a little smarter too. They never actually fought head-on for fear of what they could do to each other, but they definitely hated each other. Both of them would get smaller kids to take sides and fight for support of either Russ or Sam. Until one day, Sam became so strong that Russ had no chance. Realizing this, Russ decided to change his ways and Sam was now the big kid on the block. Believing Russ to no longer be a threat, Sam let his guard down. He never assumed there was another threat. He assumed himself to be safe. Safe from who? That's a good question. Remember the start of the story? Russ had a brother named Charles. Well, after Russ decided to stop bullying, Charles picked up the slack. But instead of going toe-to-toe with Sam, Charles cozied up to him, befriended him, even went over to his house for dinner. He became so close to Sam that Charles realized how he could beat him up through infiltration and subversion. If you haven't figured it out yet, I'm obviously talking about the Cold War and how America won, or at least a very high overview description of it. But America has made a very grave error following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and America let its guard down and assumed that communism was no longer a threat. Charles, in this case, is the Communist Chinese Party, or CCP for short. And I see a lot of people in Canada and the US who are assuming that the CCP is not a threat. I can only guess that this is the case because their infiltration and subversion is extremely hard to see unless you know how to recognize it. Out of sight, out of mind, so to speak. Well, hopefully what I share with you today will help you realize and see this threat clear as day. If you follow me on Twitter, then you know that I tweet a lot about Marxism and specifically the CCP. On a number of occasions, I've called them a scourge on humanity. And before I continue, I want to make it perfectly clear that I'm solely speaking about the ruling government of Communist China and not the Chinese people. I believe, like all people who live under communism, that the Chinese citizens are victims of their government. I was going to put this in a Twitter thread, but even though it's just the scratch of the surface, it's far too much material to post with a Twitter character limit. So that being said, I hope it's more than enough for you to realize that the threat of Communist China is very real and it's already affected your lives whether you believe it or not. The CCP has been waging a war in America for decades. Their strategy for this war is outlined in the book Unrestricted Warfare, written by two Chinese Air Force colonels, Qiao Lang and Wang Shangsu. The strategy centers completely around subversion in order to take control of society and the economy gradually, undetected, keeping the populace completely unaware, and all without the use of traditional boots-on-the-ground soldiers. The Epoch Times has a great article on this, and I'll tweet their infographic about this so that you can read it in detail. But the strategy has 4 steps: demoralize, destabilize, conflict, and intervention. The first step, demoralization. This involves the subversion and use of propaganda, media, culture, disinformation, and misinformation. Communists are masters of lies and they push their propaganda to us quite literally on a 24/7 basis. The CCP actually employs what's called the 50-cent party, which is an army of internet trolls who browse Reddit, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and any other digital platform to make comments defending the Chinese government in order to influence public opinion. A study from 2017 noted that the CCP has hired as many as 2 million people to post comments either defending China's position in political debates or attacking America's. The study showed that CCP fakes at least 450 million online comments each year to push this propaganda. How does this look in real time? Take a look at any of Trump's tweets. Do you honestly think that many people hate him compared to your real-life encounters? Most of those are fake 50-cent party employees. Debbie from Tallahassee is most likely a private in the 50-cent party of Beijing. Keep that in mind next time you want to argue with some stranger online. You're going up against a paid opponent. In regards to media infiltration, in June of this year, the State Department labeled 4 Chinese outlets as propaganda outlets under direct control of the CCP. These included the China Central Television, the China News Service, the People's Daily, and the Global Times. A peer-reviewed Harvard study this year analyzed the CCP's English language presence on Facebook and discovered 3 common themes: posts praising the CCP's response to the coronavirus outbreak, changing historical stories of how the CCP reacted to the virus, and using paid ads to promote the CCP's message. The only reason these are posted online in English is because you are the target of their misinformation. And even if you don't spend time on social media, you're not immune to their propaganda. You watch movies, right? Well, so does China. In fact, China is the number 2 movie-watching nation in the world behind the US, and Hollywood is capitulating to their propaganda demands, all to sell a few tickets. The CCP is financing Hollywood blockbusters and buying movie theaters. They only let movies play within their borders if they approve of what's in the script. The reaction to all this? Hollywood is obeying their demands and you're sitting down with popcorn to watch the lies. Here are a few examples. Last summer, Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post reported the 2020 trailer for the Top Gun sequel omitted the Taiwanese and Japanese flags on Tom Cruise's flight jacket. Remember, China does not recognize Taiwan. In 2016, Doctor Strange cast the Mystic as a Caucasian woman. Why? Because the character is supposed to be a Tibetan monk and Communist China again doesn't recognize a free Tibet either. In 2012, the James Bond film Skyfall removed a scene in which a Chinese security guard was killed and omitted all references to torture by Chinese agents. If you didn't see the 2015 film Pixels, don't worry because not many people did, but they removed references to a communist conspiracy. There are many more examples, but I'll finish with a few from World War Z in 2013. Spoiler alert, but the source of the original zombie outbreak virus was changed from China to North Korea, and the Tibetan city of Lhasa, being the last surviving city of the zombie outbreak, was completely removed. All of these subtle changes may seem harmless at first glance, but what it does is ignore the atrocities and crimes the communist Chinese government is responsible for. Imagine if we made a movie about Nazi Germany and removed any references to genocide or concentration camps. As time went on, the more this is ignored, the easier it's forgotten. That's what the CCP is trying to accomplish with Hollywood. Step 2. Destabilization involves drug smuggling and infiltration of our political, educational, industrial, economic, financial, technological, and telecommunication industries. As far as I can tell, we're currently in the latter phases of stage 2, and there is ample evidence of this. The first point, drug smuggling. We're all aware of the opioid epidemic ravaging the inner cities of America and Canada, but do you know where fentanyl is produced and how it gets here? It's produced in China. Ben Westhoff is an investigative journalist who traced how fentanyl gets to our inner cities. Posing as an undercover drug dealer, he went to a fentanyl lab near Shanghai and discovered that the drug labs are actually subsidized by the Chinese government. The research costs and the office buildings all receive tax breaks. Then they ship these opioids off to Canada and Mexico to be trafficked into the US, or they're shipped directly to the US mainland from Hong Kong. And just a few weeks ago, a Chinese national, Xu Yongwu, pled guilty in federal court for laundering over $4 million for Latin American drug cartels. Earlier this week, it looked as if the FBI had finally woken up to the threat of CCP infiltration and theft. On July 7th, FBI Director Christopher Wray held a press conference in which he addressed the direct threat the CCP is posing on America. Take a listen.
To achieve its goals and surpass America, China recognizes it needs to make leaps in cutting-edge technologies. But the sad fact is that instead of engaging in the hard slog of innovation, China often steals American intellectual property and then uses it to compete against the very American companies it victimized, in effect, cheating twice over. They're targeting research on everything from military equipment to wind turbines to rice and corn seeds. Through its talent recruitment programs, like the so-called 1,000 Talents program, the Chinese government tries to entice scientists to secretly bring our knowledge and innovation back to China, even if that means stealing proprietary information or violating our export controls and conflict of interest rules.
Now, Ray specifically addresses the 1,000 Talents program, and what that is a lucrative system where the CCP pays researchers overseas to send their work and intellectual property back to mainland China. To put it simply, they're paying scientists for their research regardless of whether or not they're Chinese citizens. Take the example of University of Florida researcher Wei Hong Tan. Tan abruptly left Florida in 2019 after an investigation was opened into his failure to report funding he had been receiving from Chinese academic institutions. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, he's begun working on coronavirus testing kits. The problem? He's developing these kits for the Chinese government and not the US, where he was employed to conduct his research. Another example of this is of Simon Ong, a professor at the University of Arkansas who was charged with wire fraud earlier this year after he was discovered to be receiving payments via the Thousand Talents program. Also this year, Hong Jin Tan was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for providing research on next-gen batteries to the CCP. Likewise, An Ming Hu, an associate professor of engineering at the University of Tennessee, was indicted on 3 counts of wire fraud for receiving undisclosed funding from the Beijing Institute of Technology while also receiving funding from NASA. The list of those indicted, arrested, or investigated for fraud pertaining to the Thousand Talents program is quite extensive, but perhaps the most widely known example of this is that of Dr. Charles Lieber of Harvard. In June of this year, Dr. Lieber was indicted on making false statements over his participation in the Thousand Talents program. It was discovered that he had become a strategic scientist for the Wuhan Institute of Technology, in which the CCP paid him $50,000 a month, living expenses up to $160,000, and gave him a $1.5 million grant to establish a lab at the Wuhan Institute of Technology. This was also during a time when the National Institute of Health in the US had already awarded him $15 million in government grants to conduct his research. To put it bluntly, the US taxpayer funded his research while he was simultaneously handing all intellectual property over to the CCP. That means the taxpayer is funding research that directly benefits the CCP, a regime focused on defeating America. The Thousand Talents program is not limited to university researchers either. In February, Congressman Jim Banks of Indiana urged California Governor Gavin Newsom to fire the CIO of California's public pension, Yu Ben Mang, due to his ties to the Thousand Talents program. This came after Communist Chinese newspaper articles took credit for Mang being in his position. China People's Daily, one of the media outlets labeled as an extension of the CCP by the State Department, printed this quote of Mang. "In human life," he said, "if there is an opportunity to serve the motherland, such responsibility and honor cannot be compared to anything." Consider this of Gavin Newsom. Just 2 weeks ago, he instituted a statewide requirement to wear masks due to COVID-19. This comes just a little over a month of his announcement regarding a $1 billion trade deal with China to supply the state with face masks. I fully expect the Chinese media to use this to further propagandize how America is struggling with the pandemic while China has supposedly defeated it. Keep in mind, Newsom has a laundry list of questionable practices, including ordering 19 counties to shut down their vineyards and wine tasting rooms while keeping the ones he owns open for business during COVID-19. Aside from corrupt university professors in the Thousand Talents program, even our children and young adults are not immune to the propaganda from the CCP. They've infiltrated our academic institutions as well. You may not have heard of them, but there are over 500 Confucius Institutes around the world and over 80 in the US alone. These are public educational partnerships between colleges and universities in China and colleges and universities in other countries. The partnerships are funded and arranged in part by the Chinese Ministry of Education, and they spend hundreds of millions of dollars subsidizing American education on university campuses. According to the CCP, the Confucius Institutes are an important part of their soft power that are used to expand China's influence. These institutes are built with the allure of teaching about Chinese language, culture, and history, but in the CCP's own words, there is something far more sinister. In 2011, Politburo member Li Chengcheng said this of the Confucius Institutes, that their brand has a natural attractiveness, and using the excuse of teaching Chinese language, everything looks reasonable and logical. And he went on to say that the institutes are an important part of Chinese overseas propaganda setup. Look around today at how many young people view communist China and even Marxism or socialism favorably. Why would we purposely allow the communist Chinese government to be part of our education system is completely asinine. If you follow the money, I can guarantee you that Beijing has as many politicians and academic institutions as you can count on their payroll. Imagine if we lived in the 1970s and the Soviet Union was trying to do the same. It could very well have led to war. Thankfully, we have some politicians in the West and even a man in the White House who recognize that the Communist Chinese Party and these Confucius Institutes are a threat. In March of this year, Senator Chuck Grassley penned a letter to 74 universities warning them that the Confucius Institutes are fronts for Chinese propaganda. Considering Christopher Wray's statement of how half of the currently open 5,000 FBI counterintelligence investigations pertain to China, every single one of these Confucius Institutes should be immediately closed. And what about technological infiltration and theft? Well, during these coronavirus lockdowns, it was discovered that the Zoom teleconferencing app was being spied on by China as well. And the data was even routed through Chinese servers, which could be accessed by CCP officials. That important business meeting you had in April on Zoom? Yeah, they were listening to that. TikTok's no different. What seems like a harmless app on your phone for making silly videos is actually another example of a CCP spying device. If you have TikTok on your phone, the CCP has access to everything else. And if you're not taking this seriously yet, then perhaps you'll remember when Equifax was hacked in 2017 and the personal data of over 150 million Americans was stolen. It was found that the Chinese military was directly responsible for that hack. And in 2018, while exploring an expansion of its Prime Video streaming service, Amazon discovered a tiny microchip the size of a grain of rice on the motherboards of a third-party Chinese company called Elemental Technologies. The chip opened up a backdoor for the CCP to gain access into any network these devices were on. The result was at least 30 American companies having their data stolen by the CCP, and along with Amazon, that also included Apple. Now do you understand why nobody wants Huawei on their country's 5G network? Huawei is a Chinese telecommunications company. If they're on your network, you can bet the CCP is collecting all data that passes through it. And these infiltration tactics are not unique to the US either. Communist China has infiltrated every level of government around the world. In 2017, the Australian Security Intelligence Organization identified 10 state and local candidates with links to Chinese intelligence agencies. One even won his election. Until the start of the coronavirus pandemic, China has rarely been in the news, despite everything I've covered so far having deserved front-page coverage. That being said, President Trump has been harping on communist China nearly daily. The reaction of those on the left? Nancy Pelosi said that it was a distraction. A distraction from what? She would rather defend a foreign communist nation than the country she swore to serve. Extreme scrutiny should be placed on China, nothing less, and they have done nothing of that. The only person that has done that is President Trump. When Trump announced the U.S. complete withdrawal from the World Health Organization, make no mistake about it, that was a direct shot across the bow at China. China doesn't stop at trying to infiltrate America directly. They also have a commanding share of United Nations NGOs, the most visible one being the World Health Organization. According to The WHO, on January 14th, they tweeted, quote, "According to the latest information we have, there is no clear evidence of sustained human-to-human transmission, and there are no infections reported among healthcare workers for COVID-19. We obviously know that was not true, considering Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post reported that the CCP knew the virus was spreading as far back as November 17th. In February, World Health Organization Director Tedros visited Beijing and praised the CCP's efforts to contain the virus. During his visit, Tedros proclaimed how impressed he was with President Xi and his personal leadership in tackling the outbreak. Now, you might ask yourself why the director of the World Health Organization would praise China in February when we now know that rather than really tackle and control the outbreak, the CCP did everything in their power to cover it up and lie to the rest of the world in order to look good. Bear in mind, China lobbied hard to get Tedros elected as director of the World Health Organization, and this was despite him being accused of covering up 3 cholera outbreaks while he was the health minister of Ethiopia. Once director, he announced his intentions to appoint Zimbabwean dictator Robert Mugabe as World Health Organization Goodwill Ambassador, and this is a man who was responsible for genocide in Zimbabwe. Other diplomats argue that Tedros' appointment of Mugabe was a payback to China for getting him elected. After all, Mugabe was a longtime ally of China. Now, does it surprise you why Tedros urged nations to not close their borders to China in February? The Democrats all criticized Trump for doing it, but who pays their bills? Taiwan warned of human-to-human transmission of the virus, but the World Health Organization won't even allow them to be a member. Is it all starting to make sense why Trump had the US leave? It's a corrupt organization who serves the interests of a communist nation. It has nothing to do with health. Step 3 of their secret war involves proxy and guerrilla warfare, controlled opposition, and terrorist attacks. Like I mentioned earlier, I think we're still in Step 2, but there are some things that tell me Step 3 isn't far off. In August of 2019, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency announced the seizure of 52,000 illegal gun parts from China and another seizure of over 10,000 parts last month in Louisville. My question is, why are these coming from China? Where is their destination, and who were they intended for? My guess is a good portion of these were meant for terrorist or anarchist groups in the US. Considering all the unrest we're seeing right now with Antifa and other anarchists, we know these people don't have jobs, so how exactly are they being financed? Step 4 of the secret war involves more traditional warfare tactics: EMPs, biomedical attacks, and electronic interference. Now, we're not at that step yet, but given the recent months with the coronavirus outbreak and the questions surrounding the Wuhan lab, you might even be able to make the argument that China actually is in step 4. As recently as 2 days ago, there are defectors from the Wuhan lab that are working with the FBI, and they're claiming that China was covering up from the start. So when the details finally come to light and we'll know everything what happened in the lab, perhaps they were manipulating coronaviruses to make them more susceptible to human transmission and easier to spread. But perhaps the most worrying step China has taken recently is that of their national security law and crackdown of the free citizens of Hong Kong. And I want to remind you that there are currently over 300,000 US citizens living in Hong Kong and another 300,000 Canadian citizens there as well. Hong Kong has been violently stripped of its freedoms, and China's new national security law enabled Beijing to crack down on dissent, and dissent in their terms has the loosest of definitions. If you dare criticize the CCP or Beijing, you've now broken the law and can be arrested and imprisoned. The law is actually worded so ambiguously that they've applied it to the entire world. It sounds laughable, but with the amount of influence and infiltration they've committed across the globe, what do you think their plans are for countries who have extradition treaties with China and Hong Kong? It's not a joke. The CCP knows exactly what they're doing, and Canada actually immediately cancelled its extradition treaty with Hong Kong as soon as the law went into effect. And what does China do to its prisoners? Well, a tribunal in 2019 concluded that China forcibly removes organs from its detainees. It's a $1 billion a year industry in China, and it's a practice that the world should be as outraged with as we are with the thought of Nazi death camps. Prisoners are strapped down and their organs are forcibly removed. Just last week in Hong Kong, a police officer arrested an Epoch Times reporter and threatened to send them to mainland China where their organs would be harvested alive. 5 months ago, Professor Xu Zhengrun of Beijing called for an investigation into the cover-up of the coronavirus outbreak by the CCP, writing that there is a, quote, rot that goes straight up to Beijing. On July 6th, he was formally arrested by the CCP and held for 6 days and released on the morning of July 12th. His crime? He dared criticize his government. Ray said in his announcement this week that the CCP is on a mission to become the world's only superpower, and they will work towards this goal by any means necessary. Everything I've described up to now certainly falls under the umbrella of by any means necessary. So while the left has spent the last 4 years shrieking about Russian collusion, they haven't had a single peep about what the communist Chinese are doing. You have to wonder whose team they're really on. I've only just scratched the surface of communist Chinese infiltration, and truly this topic could be an ever-growing series. But what I hope you got out of this today is to no longer assume that just because you can't see China as a threat, that it isn't one. They've treated America as an enemy for decades. It's time you do the same to them. I call communist China the other deep state for a reason. Ask yourself one question. Who benefits most if Trump doesn't win in November?